Hi, everyone. We're going to wait a second till Adrienne Rubin, our adult learning director, gives us the thumbs up. We're letting everybody in, and that takes a minute or so. So just get yourselves comfortable. We have a wonderful, wonderful program today. We'll get started as soon as I'm told we can.
People are still trickling in.
As soon as our Zoom master gives us the thumbs up.
Thanks, Rabbi. They're still trickling in, so we'll give everybody a minute. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here.
A very nice group.
We sure do. Okay, I think we can get started, Rabbi.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. This program is a part of our ongoing series honoring Israel's 75th birthday and Temple Sinai's 75th birthday. And there are many components to our celebration of these two very important milestones. Among them, of course, as you know, is our endowment campaign. And we hope that all of you will consider helping us to secure our future by making a contribution of tzedakah to that campaign. If you have any questions, of course, you can reach out to me or to Adrienne or to Michelle Golden, our campaign chair. And today we are very blessed and honored to have Yossi, Klein, Halevi with us. In a moment, Barbara Wallach, a member of our adult learning committee, is going to introduce Yossi. I will just say that, as I said to him, I cherish him as one of the most important voices for me about how to understand and assimilate what's happening in the state of Israel. And we are at a real inflection point now with this new government. And Yossi's was the first voice I wanted to hear because he is brilliant, he's thoughtful, he's got an amazingly important Jewish soul. And because he has a very moderate voice, and a very discerning voice and a very nuanced voice. I've read, as I said to him, everything that I know of that he has written, including his extraordinary books. I also just want to say one word about Zionism and Temple Sinai and about me. No Israeli government, and certainly no government official, no matter how much I disagree with them, can in any way diminish my Zionist commitments. The state of Israel is about many things. It is about saving Jewish lives. It is about rescuing Jews. It's about the resurrection of Jewish culture and Jewish identity. And no temporal government can in any way cause me to diminish my commitment and my gratitude for the state of Israel. That will never change. What sometimes changes is the determination that we all have to make to work with our friends and our allies in the state of Israel who are fighting for an Israel that meets its aspirations according to its founding documents. And that's the moment where we are now. I am not, as all of you know, I'm not one to openly criticize Israel, to become a part of an anti-Israel bandwagon. But I do believe that there are moments where we have to support those who are fighting against bigotry, against racism, against homophobia, against misogyny. And we have a lot of friends in Israel who are doing that. And we support them, as you know. And we support the organizations like our own Religious Action Center of the Reform Movement in Israel and the Reform Movement in Israel, among many. So that's where I am. But when this new government was created, the first voice I wanted us all to hear was Yossi's. And so I'm really grateful, Yossi, that you've made the time to be with us. And I know our community is going to learn a great deal from you today. And so now I'm going to ask Barbara to formally introduce you, and then we're going to get to hear from you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi, and good morning, everyone. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Over 150 Muslim leaders have participated in this unique program. He is co-host, together with Danielle Hartman, Ilana Stein-Hain of the Hartman Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake. Halevi's 2013 book, Like Dreamers, won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award, and his latest book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, is a New York Times bestseller and has appeared in 12 languages. Yossi has written for leading op-ed pages in North America and is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. He is frequently quoted on Israeli, Middle Eastern, and Jewish affairs in leading media around the world, and is one of the best-known lecturers on Israeli issues in the American Jewish community and on North American campuses. He is the 2019 Figure of Reconciliation Award, of the Polish Council of Christians and Jews. Born in Brooklyn, Yossi received his bachelor's degree in Jewish studies from Brooklyn College and his master's in journalism from Northwestern University. He moved to Israel in 1982 and lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Sarah, who helps direct a center for Jewish meditation. They have 3 children, and we learned this morning, God willing, are expecting a grandchild this March. Thank you, Yossi, for sharing your Sunday with Temple Sinai of Roslyn for this very important discussion. And now I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Barbara. And thank you all for joining. Thank you for having me. And Rabbi, I'm very grateful to you for those warm words, both to me personally and about Israel. And you said what for me is really the key word that should determine a Jewish relationship with Israel, and that's gratitude. And to simply recognize how the state of Israel has transformed Jewish life and where we would be today without a state of Israel. And so I'm very grateful for your words, for your leadership, and wonderful to be with all of you. So what I'm going to unpack for you today is this very difficult moment, a moment of crisis in Israel. Perhaps the most difficult moment that I've encountered since moving to Israel in the summer of 1982. I'll have more to say about that summer a bit later in our conversation. But I moved to Israel in the summer of 1982. This is my 40th year as an Israeli. And this is, for me, the most difficult, in fact, traumatic period that I've known in all these years. And what makes this so difficult is that this feels like a self-inflicted wound, an unnecessary wound. When we deal with existential threats from without, then we know how to rally together. It's very different when we're dealing with an existential threat from within. And I do believe that this is an existential moment. But before I get to the crisis of democracy, which is really the topic I'd like to unpack today, let me say a few words in praise of Israeli democracy. And the word that comes most to mind when I think about Israel's democracy is miracle. Israeli democracy is a miracle. There is no other democracy that I can think of today or at any time in history that was born in war and that effectively never knew a day of peace. Siege, terror, from one war to the next, from one front to the next, boycott, political isolation, campaigns of demonization, without respite. And at the same time, while this pressure cooker is trying to get its bearing in one of the most volatile regions in the world, we are absorbing one wave after another of destitute refugees coming from non-democratic countries, from countries with no democratic experience, which is to say that over 90% of Israelis have their family roots in countries that were not democracies. And so you bring these traumatized waves of refugees from the Middle East, from Eastern Europe, from the DP camps in Germany after the Holocaust, and you bring these refugees into this pressure cooker, and one could have expected that Israel's fragile democratic institutions would have collapsed under the weight of the internal and external pressures. But in fact, what actually happened is that Israel's democratic institutions and its democratic ethos has actually grown over the years. Israel today, I would argue, is a stronger democracy, or at least it has been until the last few months. Was a stronger democracy than probably any time in its history. And so there really is something extraordinary, and I would say miraculous, in the story of Israeli democracy. And Israel's democracy is a kind of a test case, almost a laboratory, for what happens to a democracy under conditions of extremity. And in that sense, I would argue that Israel's democratic flaws are as instructive and as useful as our democratic successes, because Israel is a case study in what happens to democracy when you apply relentless pressure, security pressure, internal pressure on a young and fragile democracy. Now, even as I'm celebrating Israeli democracy, it is important to indicate that Israel is not a paragon of democracy. It isn't the country that you look to see what's the finest example of democracy in action. Israel is not a paragon of democracy because, quite honestly, a country that's under permanent siege, that deals with the kinds of overwhelming security issues that we deal with, cannot possibly be a paragon in any objective sense of a functioning democracy. And when you factor in the fact that we're ruling over another people, we're occupying another people, I believe we don't have a choice. I don't think there's any safe way, anytime in the foreseeable future, for Israel to exit the occupation. But nevertheless, the occupation, and any occupation, is inherently a challenge to a democratic society. And so we are not a paragon of democracy. But what we are a paragon of is the struggle for democracy under near impossible conditions, under conditions that I believe what any other country in our place would have long since abandoned its search for balance between security and the democratic ethos, democratic norms. And so in that sense, I celebrate Israel as an extraordinary paragon of the struggle for democracy under conditions that should have defeated us as a democracy a long time ago. When I speak about Israel as Israeli democracy as a miracle, I do so not only in a celebratory sense, but also with a certain amount of anxiety. Because a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature. A miracle is not something you can take for granted. And a miracle has to be nurtured. And what we've seen in the last months with the rise of this new government, the most extreme nationalist and ultra-Orthodox government in Israel's history, the most homogeneous government in Israel's history, is rather than an attempt to nurture Israel's democratic ethos and institutions, the opposite is happening. Israel's democracy is under growing assault from within. Now, in the United States, you also experienced 4 years of an assault on democratic norms, on democratic governance. But America is a much older and more mature democracy than Israel. Your institutions are stronger. And for all the damage that Trump did to democratic discourse, to the discourse of civility in America, America's democratic institutions have held. I deeply worry that Israel's democratic institutions are going to be subjected to the kinds of pressure that may test us to the breaking point. Now, the focal point of the assault on democracy that this government has taken on is an attempt to transform the judicial system. Now, it's true when government supporters note that the Israeli Supreme Court has overdone judicial activism. There's a great deal of truth to that. We have what is probably the most activist court in the world. I think there's good reason for that. Israel doesn't have a constitution. We only have one house of parliament, which effectively means that the prime minister controls 2 out of the 3 branches of what should be a balance of power, checks and balances. The last remaining checks and balance is the Supreme Court. And so there was this natural tendency on the part of the court to try to take as much power as possible for itself in order to balance the prime minister and parliament. The problem is that in the process, the Supreme Court alienated large parts of Israeli society and really did go too far in overextending judicial activism. So we do need to modify how judges are appointed. We need more input from parliament. We need some form of parliamentary override of Supreme Court decisions. And I'm emphasizing some form of moderate input. But that's not at all what this government is attempting. This government's policies are nothing less than a radical transformation of the judiciary to the point that it will endanger Israeli democracy. And let me elaborate. There are 3 questions that we should be asking about the government's judicial plan. The first is, naturally, what is the substance of the plan and what will be the likely impact of the government's plan, of implementing the government's plan? The second is, how is the process of implementation taking place? And third, who is initiating the plan? And what are the motives? So, in answer to the first question, substance, what is the substance of this plan? The government is proposing a simple parliamentary override of the Supreme Court, which means that a simple majority of 61 Knesset members out of 120 seats will be able to override any Supreme Court decision. What that effectively means is that the prime minister, who controls parliament, will be able as well to neutralize any Supreme Court decision. That will effectively destroy whatever fragile checks and balances we've had in place until now. It will concentrate all power in the hands of the prime minister. In terms of the process in which this radical transformation is being implemented, there is no attempt at a national conversation, no attempt at negotiating with the judiciary. It is being done in the most brutal way possible. And there is the prime minister has said he's prepared to negotiate, but he's not prepared to suspend the legislative process that will implement the plan. In other words, negotiations will happen under the gun. The president of Israel, which is largely a ceremonial post, Yitzhak Herzog, has suggested a 14-day moratorium on the legislative process for the government's plan, in which time negotiations can happen. I think that the opposition to the government will be well within its rights to dismiss that offer as woefully inadequate. You don't negotiate under the gun. There needs to be a serious process. This is the most far-reaching changes in the nature of Israeli governance, probably since the creation of the state. It requires a deep breath and a serious process. That's not what's happening. And finally, to the question of who is implementing this plan, very simply, a prime minister who's on trial on 3 counts of corruption. In other words, he has a deeply vested interest in being able to appoint judges and perhaps appoint the judges who will sit and on his trial. And so from every perspective, this is an outrageous plan. Now, what makes this moment so difficult is that this government is not only assaulting Israel's democratic identity, it is also challenging the way in which we have always understood, and by we, I mean the majority of Israelis, have always understood what it means to be a Jewish state. Israel is based, as you all know, on 2 foundational identities, as a Jewish state and a democratic state. What we meant all these years by a democratic state is not only the simple rule of the majority, but a delicate dance between the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority, which is what the court is intended to protect, the rights of the minority. And this government has a very different notion of democracy. For this government, a simple majority should be able to determine everything. In other words, what the government is saying is that democracy can be used to implement a non-democratic system of government. We know that from other situations. We know that from other regimes. And we also know how that turns out. Now, this government is intending to challenge, in the same way that it's challenging that basic understanding of what a democracy means, a democracy that protects the rights of the minority, not only of the majority. In that same way, this government is intending to upend how we understand what it means to be a Jewish state. Now, to understand the divide in Israeli society, a majority of Israelis have always affirmed that Israel is the state of the Jewish people, that that's what we mean by Israel as a Jewish state. And a minority of Israelis, a substantial minority, but still a minority, have insisted that Israel is not just the state of the Jewish people, but also the state of Judaism. And not just of Judaism, but of Orthodox Judaism. Now, certainly we have laws and institutions that go partway toward compromising with Israel as the state of Orthodox Judaism. We have an official chief rabbinate. As you all know, matters of personal status are determined by the Orthodox chief rabbinate. But within that system, there was a great deal of latitude. And what this government is trying to do is close those loopholes. And I'll explain what I mean momentarily. But I want to take a step back for a moment and unpack this idea of Israel as the state of the Jewish people versus Israel as the state of Judaism. Classical Zionism, as it was emerging in the late 19th century in Europe, recognized that modernity had brought a fundamental crisis in Jewish identity. Until the advent of modernity, Jews around the world, in virtually every Jewish community, every part of the diaspora, were all adherents to rabbinic Judaism, which meant that a Jew could travel the diaspora from Yemen to Poland in the Middle Ages, 17th century, and feel reasonably at home in any Jewish community because the language, the sensibility, the rituals, the belief system were more or less the same or similar enough to feel familiar. Beginning with the 19th century, this uniformity begins to break down. And I should add, by the way, that this is an extraordinary historic achievement of rabbinic Judaism. And we owe rabbinic Judaism an enormous debt. It held the Jewish people together through 1,700 years of dispersion. In the 1800th year, it began to unravel. And Zionism comes along and says, well, religion is no longer holding us together. In fact, religion is one of the forces that's most dividing us in modernity. And so we need a new way to define ourselves that will hold us together. And Zionism offered a very basic way of a minimalistic way in which Jews could keep together by saying Jewish identity is in and of itself sufficient. We don't need a religious identity. If we are all Jews, then we are part of the same peoplehood. So we're elevating peoplehood as the central way in which Jews can come together. The minority position in the state of Israel has been that that's not enough. In order for Israel to be an authentic, quote, an authentic Jewish state, it must reflect the values, the sensibility, the commitments of Orthodox Judaism. And that's what this government is now aggressively committed to implementing. It is tightening the loopholes in those areas where there has been even liberal Orthodox expressions that are outside the reach of the official chief rabbinate. For example, the previous government, the last year, implemented an alternative system of kosher supervision outside of the chief rabbinate, which is a very problematic institution in terms of corruption. And so this previous government allowed there to be alternative means of kosher supervision. This incoming government has done away with that. It is also abolishing government funding for secular expressions of Jewish identity. And this government is looking to close all of those loopholes that have really made it possible for Israelis such as myself to breathe. Even though we don't officially have religious pluralism here, there is enough religious pluralism in practice on the ground. I don't mean on the state level, but on the local level, to allow Israelis to feel that this system, with all of its problems, is still, one can still navigate. One can still live a meaningful Jewish life that's not being defined by the chief rabbinate. That is now under threat. The greatest threat that I see coming soon is that this government will attempt to change the law of return. Now, the law of return is the seminal defining law of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, rather than as the state of Judaism. And the reason that I say that is that the law of return does not define a Jew according to Orthodox law, but it defines a Jew according to a new Israeli construct. Anyone, not only with a single parent, whether a mother or a father, which of course is the Reform movement's definition, the law of return goes much farther. Anyone with a single Jewish grandparent is eligible for citizenship in the state of Israel, and by implication is invited to join Israeli Jewish society, which is exactly what has happened with many, many thousands of immigrants from the former Soviet Union who came under what we call the grandchild clause and were absorbed into Jewish Israeli society. The government seems intent on rolling back the grandchild clause and moving us into the place where only those with a single Jewish parent will be granted Israeli citizenship. For now, that would include patrilineal Jews, and I assume that that's where the government will pause, but I don't know if the government will entirely stop there. And so this is really what we're looking at in the foreseeable future, a major assault not only on our understanding, the liberal understanding of Israel as a democratic state, but the liberal understanding of Israel as a Jewish state. I'll go on for another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open for conversation. There's something extraordinary about this moment. If you compare this government to the government that we had over the last year and a half. The previous government, which was headed by Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, Mansour Abbas, was remarkable in its radical diversity. It may well have been the most diverse government in Israel's history. Not only did the government span from hard left through center to hard right, but it was the first ever Israeli government that brought in an Arab party to the table. So it was our first Jewish-Arab governing coalition. And we went from that peak, for me, one of the most hopeful times that I've experienced as an Israeli, to this moment, which is one of the least hopeful that I've known. And there's something in that abrupt transition that is very much symbolic of Israeli reality. Israel is a kind of a roller coaster. You just never know when the roller coaster is going to dip, when we're going to have an Entebbe rescue, when we're going to have a war, when there's going to be a massive immigration, when there's going to be some deeply depressing corruption scandal breaking out. Israeli reality is so fluid in a very extreme way, as if you juxtapose these two governments. There's nothing more extreme than the transition that we've just experienced. And ironically, the very fluidity, the very radical nature of Israeli reality, the way that we shift so quickly from mode to mode, actually gives me hope for this moment. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that I recently celebrated the 40th anniversary of my Aliyah, of my immigration to Israel. And I came in the summer of 1982, which was one of the lowest points in the Israeli story. For those of you who may recall, It was the beginning of the first Lebanon War. It was the moment when Israeli society, for the first time, divided bitterly over a war. War is always what had united Israelis. And now suddenly we were tearing ourselves apart over a war that had never happened to us before then, and it's never happened to us since. At the same time, there were growing tensions between Jews from European origins, called Ashkenazim, against Jews from the East, Mizrahim, to the point where people were speaking openly about a civil war, an ethnic civil war. Inflation was reaching nearly 400%. It was South American proportions. There was virtually no immigration coming into the country. And as a result of the Lebanon War, Israel was more isolated than it had ever been before. If you fast forward to the reality today, every one of those crises, which seemed to me then as a new immigrant to be an existential threat, insoluble threats, every one of those crises has either been entirely solved or has largely faded away. Today, if God forbid we have to go to war, the country is united. In place of 400% inflation, we have startup nation. In place of the threat of an ethnic civil war between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, you have more marriage between the two communities than we've ever had before. There is, thanks to the tensions in Russia and the war in Ukraine, a drastic uptick in immigration. And as far as Israel's isolation goes, we may be making peace with Saudi Arabia in the coming months. We have peace with more Arab countries than we've ever had before. And so what gives me hope for this terrible moment in Israel's history, and there is no way to gloss over it, is the fact that you can never freeze the frame and say, this is Israel. You can say that now, and there'll be some new drastic event that will upend any of our assumptions about Israel in good ways and bad ways. And so all I can say at this point is we all need to strap ourselves in, fasten our seatbelts, and do what we can. Both I'm speaking of myself as an Israeli citizen, and I'm also speaking about you as lovers of Israel. We need to figure out together what can be done to defend Israeli democracy at a very dangerous moment in Israeli history. So let's open for conversation.
Yossi, thank you so much. I think I speak for all of us here, and we're a large crowd this morning when I say that I could listen to you speak all day long, and you've given us so much food for thought. We have a number of thoughtful questions here, so I'm going to get right to them. When you look in the mirror, what do you believe has been the failure of the left from a messaging standpoint that has allowed the far right to regain control of the political narrative in Israel?
It's a great question. I would qualify the political camp that I belong to. I'm not part of the left. Most Israelis who think like me are actually not left. There's virtually no left in Israel. Look at the Knesset. Meretz, which was the most left-wing of the Zionist parties, is out. And the Labor Party, the party that founded the state of Israel, is now the smallest party in the Knesset, 4 seats. The main opposition to the right is not the left, but the center. And I come from the center, and I'm speaking about Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, There Is a Future, and Benny Gantz's National Party, Mamlachti Party, National Unity Party. Those are the two main parties that are holding up the opposition. Where we went wrong is that we didn't sufficiently pay attention to how many Israelis perceived the last government. we were celebrating the breakthrough in Arab-Jewish relations as a major victory for Zionism. But Netanyahu was very effectively portraying the government as a sellout to an Arab party, and that Israel and that this last government was effectively anti-Zionist. And many, many good Israelis bought into that lie. And we didn't try to defend ourselves. We didn't try to explain why this was such an important achievement for Zionism, to bring in an Arab party into an Israeli coalition. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we have minimized the ongoing wound and grievance of Mizrahim. It's much less than it was when I came here in 1982, but it's still part of Israeli society, and it needs to be paid much closer attention to. And finally, we didn't pay enough attention to Israeli security fears. And those security fears are legitimate. They're always legitimate, but they were especially legitimate after the riots last year in what we call the mixed Arab-Jewish towns and cities, which were the worst riots in Israel's history since 1948. And that created an enormous sense of insecurity on the part of many Israeli Jews. And the previous government didn't sufficiently address those insecurities. I actually think that the last government did a terrific job on security, but it didn't, it failed to explain itself. So that's where I think we failed. And what I'm seeing coming from the center now, belatedly, almost too belatedly, is a much more aggressive pushback against the campaign of deceptions and what we call in Hebrew fake news. Did you ever hear that expression? It's a Hebrew term. Fake news.
Once or twice, yes, we've heard that bandied about.
So, all right, it's good to know that Hebrew is being adopted into American discourse.
Part of the vernacular, yes. Thanks, Yossi. Our next question, you refer to this court as taking power and engaging in activism. By activism, are you referring to the role of overriding legislation or something more? This court has overturned 22 laws in 31 years. Is that really activism?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I think that the court communicated what it considers to be normative to the Knesset, and I think that the parties internalized what is likely to pass and what isn't. That's one aspect here, and the court also created an ethos which was very Western in its orientation. And there is an argument to be made that the court should have taken into greater account the fact that Israel is not just a Western society, but we're also an Eastern society. And in Eastern societies, collective identities are more important than individual identities. It's the exact opposite of the West. And so a court in Israel should have tried to do a better job in balancing and also in explaining itself. I mean, I come back to that idea. The court did not explain itself well. And so I am more of a champion of the court, including the court's activism, than I am a detractor. Nevertheless, I think that the deep alienation the alienation really affected large numbers of people, should have been taken more into account.
Yossi, thank you. Our next question, I have read a lot and struggled to understand the proposed judicial reforms. There are respected and credible voices on both sides. How should we weigh those conflicting opinions, and why shouldn't we view this as a typical policy dispute that the democratic process will resolve? Governments change regularly in Israel, and the current majority will be subject to these changes once they are in the minority.
So first of all, in terms of what these changes can produce, the great fear is that if all power is effectively concentrated in the prime minister's hands, he can rig the rules for the next election. We saw that happening in Hungary. There is a clear intention for this government to assault the media, and especially the independent media, and which is what Orban did. The government is attempting not only to bring in a simple override in the Knesset, but also to do away with the legal advisors in each of the ministries, or to do away with the independence of the legal advisors, so that the legal advisors will not be representing the courts, will not be representing the public, but will be representing the politicians. So this is the changes that they're planning is so deep, and it goes on so many levels, that the fear here of those of us who are out on the streets every week is that this government, if it remains in power for 4 years, and if it succeeds in passing these profound changes, could create a point of no return in the way that we've seen happening in other governments. Now, in terms of judicial authorities being on both sides, I haven't seen any front rank legal mind in Israel supporting the government's changes. I see lots of criticism of people like Daniel Friedman and others, the late Ruth Gavison, who were significant figures in major, really front rank figures in Israeli in Israeli law, and whom the Supreme Court sidelined because they were critics of the court. And that goes back to the previous question of where I think the court really failed, is that it didn't sufficiently diversify. It didn't diversify at all, for that matter. Or it did, but only too late, and too little too late. But I don't see anyone of the stature of Daniel Friedman, for example, who's been a strong critic of the court, saying what the government is planning is a good idea. And so we have to draw a distinction between the legitimate criticism of the court, which you really can point to major figures, and to the cure that this government is suggesting, which is far worse than the illness. And that's what makes this, to my mind, such an overwhelmingly one-sided debate, weighted on the side of the opponents. Not that judicial reform isn't a good idea. It is. It's necessary, but not this way, and not Netanyahu. Netanyahu and Aryeh Deri and Smotrich and Ben Gvir. We've never had a government run by so many criminals or potential criminals. Netanyahu is still technically innocent, but if he's going to insist on changing the legal system while he's still on trial, then that in itself, to my mind, is a crime.
I would agree. Yossi, do you have the time for a couple of more questions? Because we have several in the Q&A here. We in the US are about 6 years ahead, only in years, not progress. We went from a hope of post-racial America under Obama to the empowerment of white supremacy under his successor. And the continuing result is the elevation of a zero-sum dichotomy. Does the active involvement of diasporan Jews in the politics of Israel inflame that zero-sum equation?
It's a great question. I think that we are at the point where tensions have been so inflamed that we are, God forbid, in a kind of a pre-Civil War mindset. We're not there yet, but people are talking about it in a way that I haven't heard since the months before the Rabin assassination. I believe that this is an issue that is of urgent concern for the whole Jewish people. And I'm not looking to the diaspora to help save Israel from itself. That's Israelis are capable of defending this country. But I think that this is a moment that requires input from all of you as a community, and one can discuss what that would look like. But I think that Israeli leaders need to understand that diaspora Jews are looking at this moment not as, well, just one more policy debate in Israel, but as something that's going to determine the nature, the future of diaspora-Israeli relations. If Israel becomes anti-democratic, how will that affect the Jewish status of Jewish minorities in the diaspora? There are serious questions here for you as well. And I'm not appealing to the diaspora to turn away from Israel, but quite the opposite. I think this is a moment, an opportunity for diaspora Jews to publicly reaffirm what it is about Israel that has held your loyalty and love all these years. Why do you have those two flags on the bima? What do those two flags mean? When you talk about shared values, what does that mean? That's what we're fighting for right now. And we're fighting for your ability to continue holding on to those two flags. And I think we need to hear you. And again, we can discuss in what ways, but I don't think this is our fight alone.
Yossi, thank you. You just actually anticipated the next question and what I think we're going to make the last question before I know Rabbi White wants to jump back in and have a few moments with you. Thank you very much for a wonderful overview. Can you share with us the options for a path forward and what role do we take in such a path?
So the path forward will be a compromise. There will need to be more far-reaching judicial compromise than the court ever imagined that it would agree to. It's going to have to agree to that, to deeper change, but nowhere near the brutal operation that this government is proposing. The only way we're going to get to the point where real compromise will be possible is if major pressure is applied to the government. It is premature to talk about compromise now. We are dealing with a government that has no limits, that has already crossed red lines that I never imagined I would see in the state of Israel. Itamar Ben-Gvir, a devoted follower of Mayor Kahana, in charge of the Israeli police. That's almost a satire. It's so inconceivable. And on. The red lines that have already been crossed. And so pressure needs to grow, and it has to happen in the short term, in the coming weeks. And the government has to understand that there is such a wave of outrage from all directions that it's going to have no choice but to engage in a substantive process of compromise.
Yossi, thank you so much. Rabbi White, I'm going to turn it back over to you with our heartfelt thanks, Yossi, for being here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely, Yossi. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, and thanks to all of our questioners for wonderful questions. I just want to just conclude with one personal thought that I'd love you to respond to, Yossi. I would never have voted for Netanyahu as prime minister, but my sense of him is that he's far more moderate than his rhetoric and the rhetoric of the government. And so we've seen, it seems to me, some schizophrenic things coming out of Israel. So on the one hand, all that you have mentioned and all of the fears associated with it and the horrific rhetoric, and we are a people where words are power. So rhetoric cannot ever be discounted and should never be discounted. So we have people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in charge of forces with weapons. We have Maoz in charge of educational initiatives with given millions and millions and millions of dollars on the one hand. On the other hand, we have reports coming here of illegal outposts that the government did not want demolished, that were demolished. We have reports of illegal outposts that members of the government wanted to be built that were not built. And so I'm wondering if that is we have the proposed cancellation of certain Shabbat programming that ended up not being canceled. So I'm just wondering if those are real embers of hope for us. That's the first question. And the second question is, I really would love you to answer the question you have asked, which is, what should we tangibly do? In other words, what is the effective and appropriate way for American Jews to engage in this challenge? I think that'd be a great way to conclude.
Okay, so first of all, as far as the first question goes, just one correction. The initial reports were that the cancellation of the Shabbat programs had been rescinded, that the government would continue to fund them. It turns out that the cancellation has held.
Oh.
So that's, and I think that that's an indication of where things really are heading. It's true that there was one outpost, literally one structure that had been built on one hilltop, and the defense minister ordered it dismantled. That is not at all where I see this government going. It is also true what you say, that Netanyahu is generally a pragmatist. Netanyahu is not a radical in his inclinations. He's a very cautious prime minister. But there are two problems. The first problem is that he has created the most radical coalition in Israel's history, where he is the responsible grown-up, and all those around him are true believers. They are not, Ben Gvir and Smotrich are not corruptible. These, one can say I suppose in their favor, these are genuine idealists. And that makes them more dangerous because they're not corruptible. And the second factor here is Netanyahu's desperation because of his legal troubles. Netanyahu has bound himself to the worst elements in Israeli politics, the most dangerous elements, and can push back against them only so far, and they know this. And the concessions that they got from him during the process of coalition building were so over the top that it was an indication of how Netanyahu intends to essentially give in to his partners. So in terms of what we can do, what you can do, first of all, I think that we need to be hearing expressions of solidarity. The demonstrators in the streets, we've never had anything like this, where every Saturday night, over 100,000 people around the country are coming out in the rain in the middle of winter. I was in a pouring rain in Tel Aviv 2 weeks ago, and I'm still recovering from the flu that I got from that. And people are, and my greatest regret was that I was too sick to go out this Saturday night. And there's this sense of a frantic, almost a last-ditch attempt to save our democratic institutions and norms. So first of all, I think we need to be hearing expressions of solidarity. Secondly, I think that Israeli government ministers, when they walk into a meeting with diaspora leaders, need to start hearing some tough talk behind closed doors. Those meetings should not be polite, and diaspora leaders should not be allowing this government to speak in platitudes of Jewish survival and Jewish solidarity, and we are one. It's time to take the gloves off and ask them tough questions. That's at the very least. Where I think this thing should go ultimately, and I mean pretty soon, ultimately, is for there to be solidarity rallies with the protest movement at the Israeli consulate, and solidarity rallies that will not just be anti-government, but deeply pro-Israel. If you look at just the visuals of our Saturday night demonstrations, you see hundreds, if not thousands, of Israeli flags. It's an extraordinary scene. I would love to see that on the streets of New York. American Jews waving big Israeli flags and talking about what is it that we love about Israel? Why are we here? What are we defending? What is it that's precious about Israel? This moment is an opportunity not just to protest against an out of control Israeli government, but to affirm your love and appreciate your gratitude for the state of Israel. That's the tone that I'm looking for. So I hope that this has been useful, and I very much appreciate the opportunity, Rabbi, to engage and to, as always, to be with you and to hear you and to have a platform. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Yossi. It's been wonderful to have you. I know that we all, as always, learned a great deal from you. And to all of you on this call, I would highly recommend that you read Yossi's books. He is a public commentator. He writes in the Times of Israel. He also engages through the Hartman Institute. These are all available to you online. And as we now know, there's no more thoughtful and discerning a voice for us to learn and to help navigate through this most challenging inflection point in Jewish history and in Israeli history. So Yossi, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.